most dramatic entrance you got was the storm last night, supplied by the Nordic gods. If you were here, I've been in Lund for a long time, and I've never seen a show like that at all. I think that's the end of the crazy weather, but that's as much of an introduction as you'll get. Miranda, I'm delighted to have Miranda Fricker here. I won't go on at length. I think we're going to keep our introductions fairly short. All of you will know Miranda. She's the presidential professor of philosophy at City University of New York at the Graduate Center, formerly of Sheffield and Birkbeck University of London, and a fellow of the British Academy. And she, of course, is well known for her publications, particularly Epistemic Injustice. And her title of her talk today is Postscript on Having a Reason. Miranda, delighted to have you here.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I'm sure I'm not alone. I want to begin by thanking Paul and Anna too for all the wonderful organising, and we are indeed grateful to the Swedish taxpayer as well. I'm going to talk about Williams on internal reasons, and I'm going to try and just do a bit of exegesis, I'm sure some of which will be uncontroversial, I think. And then I'm going to also try and build on what I think of, we might think of it as a kind of synthetic elaboration. I think it's interesting, and I found it very illuminating to try and read Williams on internal reasons, somewhat through the lens of later work, in particular Shame and Necessity, but most of all Truth and Truthfulness. So those are the two later works I'll be emphasizing somewhat. I've no idea whether the interpretation I'm going to end up with is something that Williams would have agreed with. No doubt not. No doubt I've missed a bunch of things and missed the reasons why he didn't say exactly that, but I really hope that he would have thought it was an okay reading, and I really hope that you think it's an okay reading. I find myself believing it, so maybe by the end of this I no longer will, but it'll be interesting to see how everybody reacts. So his view, as we know, was that there are no external reasons, and you know, it's easy to when one reads secondary literature on Williams, I find it very frustrating often, and I find myself reading things that are published, not only things that are written by undergraduates, who say things like, oh, Williams thought that you didn't have a reason to do anything unless you had an item in your subjective motivational set from which there was a sound deliberative root. So, well, that's not quite true, actually, because there's already a great deal more idealization involved than that. So let me begin with this statement, and I'll explain the idealization. For an agent A to have a practical reason to X requires a sound deliberative route to Xing from some motivational state or disposition which, with relevant errors of fact and reasoning corrected, and indeed later we'll add exercises of the imagination and attention and a bunch of other things, would remain in or enter into the agent's subjective motivational set. So in the case that he has in the early paper, Internal and External Reasons, there's a case of someone having a false belief, so I want a gin and tonic. I think that the stuff in the glass on the table is gin. Unbeknownst to me, in fact, it's petrol, so we won't say I have a reason to drink the stuff in the glass. Also factored in are ignorance, not just the presence of false beliefs, but the absence of a relevant belief. I don't think he gave a specific example of this, though he did say that ignorance is another, as it were, nullifying issue when it comes to the reason. So you might imagine someone who is, serving cakes in a street party. She's formed no beliefs about whether any of the people who might come to eat one of the cakes has a nut allergy. We might say of her, on William's view, she doesn't have a reason to give this cake to this person because, in fact, it's a fact that this person will have an allergic reaction. And so there's just a sort of ignorance there, an absence of belief on her part. And then the other aspect of the idealization, not now beliefs, but rather reasoning, which he intended in the fairly strict sense of instrumental reasoning, I think, at this point. If you haven't thought through exactly what will happen when you drop out of school, then you won't count as having a reason to drop out of school, even though everything in your S is telling you to drop out of school. You just haven't thought it through properly. And so your instrumental reasoning in terms of what's going to achieve for you the ends that you seek is faulty, and thereby you don't count as having a reason. So those are just three little examples to spell out what I think of as the partial idealization, which often gets forgotten about when people quickly summarize his view, but which is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, he only thought, his view is the subhuman view. I mean, so far, we've got more or less Hume in the treatise, book 2, part 3, where he's talking about you're not counting as having a reason if the object of your desire doesn't exist or if there's something wrong with your instrumental reasoning. So far, so Humean. And this partial idealization of vis-a-vis one's epistemic conduct and instrumental reasoning is very categorically differentiated by Williams from any further sort of idealization which an external reasons theorist will go in for, the idealization of prudential and ethical ends. So for Williams, we're idealized in terms of epistemic and basic rational conduct, but we are the authors of our own ends. And I suggest, I believe Williams more or less says as much, but I would propose we pluck that out as the salient feature which it differentiates the internal reasons theorist from the external reasons theorist. Internal realist theorist stops at the partial idealization, and external reasons theorists will be happy to go on and idealize ends, both prudential and ethical. And I think already in seeing that, we see that, you know, a real important sense in which freedom is absolutely at the heart of Williams' philosophy. I think of the internal reasons theorist as fundamental to his whole philosophy, actually, because so many of the other theses flow from there. And in that sense, us being the authors of our own ends is, for me, a kind of exegetical note to really hang on to when reading any bit of Williams, more or less. Now, he offers a highly specific internal reasons-based justification for exactly that degree of idealization and no more, and I've produced it for you on the handout. This is in the later paper, Internal Reasons and the Obscurity of Blame. He says, the grounds for making this general point about fact and reasoning, as distinct from prudential and moral considerations, are quite simple. Any rational deliberative agent has in his S a general interest in being factually and rationally correctly informed. The grounds for making this general point about fact and reasoning, as distinct from prudential and moral considerations, are quite simple. Any rational deliberative agent has in his S a general interest in being factually and rationally and correctly informed. So he's saying there is a kind of universal internal reason to care about the truth. Now that's a general point, of course, we see writ large in Truth and Truthfulness, but he's very careful to point out that, of course, we often have an interest in denying things, that's to say, being in denial about things, or simply trying not to go there and find this unfortunate information one really doesn't want to know about. But those sorts of motivations are the exception to the rule, and they're essentially parasitic to our more general basic interest in having this cognitive contact with the world that is the having of true beliefs. So he doesn't sort of fetishize truth at all. He knows that the ordinary business of human life involves some interest in falsehoods and so on, but all against the backdrop of an absolutely fundamental universal interest in knowing how things are. And so that generates the universal internal reason. He wasn't against the idea that there could be universal internal reasons. I mean, after all, he entertained the possibility here and there that you can construe an external reasons theorist position in terms of the claim that, well, there are many reasons which are universally internal. That could be one way of getting in the leverage that's required for a broadly Kantian outlook. But he just didn't see any grounds for positing such universal reasons. You might find them here and there, and this is one of them, but we're not going to find very many. Now, the upshot of this partial idealized view, the internal reasons view, is that there is a very significant epistemic opacity to what my reasons are. I certainly can't merely introspect to find out what my reasons are, and this is partly, we'll see more why this is so later, but already with the materials we've got with this basic exposition, we have the idea that I can be wholly mistaken about which items are in my S. I can think I've got a motivational item from which the sound deliberative root, which is in my S, and in fact be mistaken about that. I can fail to have an item which I would have were some of my factual beliefs or my instrumental reasoning corrected. And I can be mistaken about what constitutes a sound deliberative root. So there's at least 3 moments of possible error, if you like, or opacity as I'm putting it, in terms of an individual knowing what her reasons are and needing to engage in a substantial process of finding out how to act, finding out what her reasons are, if you like. But then the conception that I already briefly mentioned that arises out of this is that the individual is the author of their own ethical and prudential ends, and that is the important fact in thinking about him as a philosopher of freedom. Now, all this means that there can be scenarios like the scenarios rehearsed by Williams in relation to the character Owen Wingrave from a Britain opera, where Owen is in a situation where there's enormous family pressure on him to join the army in order to live up to family honour and pride. And either Owen is in a situation where his family might engage him in dialogue, and at the end of the day eventually he comes to, you know, having, as it were, seen that he does have items in his S, or gained an item in his S, or seen that there is a sound deliberative root from something in his S, or that should be in his S which he hadn't yet seen, he may be persuaded by the family. But the main purpose of the example, as it's also rehearsed, is to rehearse the possibility of the opposite scenario, which is that Owen really doesn't have a reason to join up. Owen is unmoved, or sufficiently unmoved, by ideas of family honour and pride. And I think there's a sentence where Williams says, oh, he hates the whole thing. It's just not Owen. And so there's a situation where the right thing to declare of Owen is that he really doesn't have a reason. Joining up for matters of family honour and pride really isn't, to use another phrase, one of his reasons, or not one of his reasons in a sufficiently motivating position in his S to actually get him to do it and to override other considerations. And so we get this rhetorically powerful, philosophically powerful, binaristic way of thinking about reasons, that, you know, either Owen had a reason or he really didn't have a reason. It seems somewhat black and white. And if he really doesn't have a reason, and yet the family keep on going on and on about family honour and pride, it's just bluff. It's just browbeating, even coercion at the end of the day, and we should recognise it as such. And that's one moment where I think Williams thought of us, if we adhere to the internal reasons conception, as succeeding in what he later came to call resisting fantasy in philosophy, resisting the allure of certain objectivist ideas, which in fact are based in nothing, are based in bluff. Now, so far, with the materials I've brought in from him, our picture is still somewhat static looking. I mean, we've talked about the epistemic opacity and the need for a process of discovery, perhaps through deliberation and so on, but it's still looking fairly static. And the idea of this partial idealization, that I might be corrected vis-a-vis what my own reasons are through discoveries of fact and discoveries of reasoning and so on, is presented sort of counterfactually. Were I to discover that the stuff in the glass is petrol, not gin, then I wouldn't have a reason. But in the paper Internal Reasons and the Obscurity of Blame, we get more of something very explicitly dynamic. There's a bit in the earlier paper, I don't want to exaggerate, but we get more material that explicitly points us to the very dynamic aspect of how we should think about what it is to have a reason. And he moves from this more counterfactual style of putting it, were I to know that it's only petrol, then I wouldn't have a reason, therefore I don't have a reason, then to a kind of focus on real-time efforts of persuasion, real-time efforts of trying to figure out what to do, and thereby being describable as figuring out what one's reasons are. But of course, when you're figuring out what your reasons are, you're not looking in your head, you're looking out to the world. So section 2, blame and prolepsis. I said that in Williams' example of Owen Wingrave, in the scenario where he really doesn't have the reason and his family yet carries on telling him he does, they're just engaged in bluff or browbeating. And Internal Reasons and the Obscurity of Blame, he sets up a puzzle. It's ever such a complex paper, and I find myself, I go in and out of focus about which things obscure, because there's various obscurities which get clarified in the paper. But one first obscurity isn't the one he ends up with. He ends up by with a conclusion that it's the external reasons theorist who has problems with obscurity, obscurity of blame, broadly because if you are an external reasons theorist, then it looks like you are engaged in blaming someone vis-a-vis a state that could never have motivated them anyway, and that's part of the difficulty for the external reasons account. But he begins with an obscurity about blame for the internal reasons account, or at least an apparent obscurity. And the obscurity is generated like this. He observes, so look, it's quite normal for us to blame people for reasons that in some basic way they have, but they fail to act on. They do know better, they didn't give it sufficient priority in this circumstance, or they had a moment of forgetfulness or a moment of weakness, a moment of akrasia, and we blame them because, as it were, the reason's already theirs. But he says this: we also blame people for failing to act on reasons that they don't have. So it may seem a rather obvious fact about blame that someone can be blamed even though his S does not contain anything that would lead to the appropriate motivation. We can blame a man, we may think, slippery phrase there, we may blame a man, we may think, for neglecting his wife even though he has no motivation to be concerned about his wife. Now I think that phrase, which I've been directed off in different directions in different times I've read it, but I think we should understand the phrase "we may think," that qualification, as not signalling that he's going to go on to argue that this is false, but rather signalling something that he says in a footnote, which is just that in the most extreme sorts of reasons, where you've got the hardest possible case, so you've got not just the nasty husband, but the maximally nasty husband who absolutely doesn't care whether she lives or dies, such a person may be beyond blame altogether. And we'll see a little bit later just what makes such a person be in that state of being beyond all blame altogether. So that is how I interpret, though I'm open to discussion, that is how I interpret the "we may think" qualification there. Now, the reason this observation about how we blame others when they lack reasons can seem to cast the internal reasons account in obscurity vis-a-vis blame is because, you know, how can that be fair? How can it be fair to blame me for failing by the lights of a reason that isn't one of my reasons? Isn't that just like blaming Owen for not signing up to the army for reasons of family honour and pride? It doesn't look like a proper practice of blame. It looks like it would fall under the very general sort of injunction of unfair, general idea of unfair blame. And this obscurity is what Williams introduces the mechanism of proleptic blame to try and illuminate. Now, what's proleptic blame? Proleptic blame comes in precisely in those cases where the person X hypothesized doesn't have the reason. Right? And it's important that they'll have lots of other reasons and maybe some general reasons in which the reason could have been embedded, but they don't have the reason to sign up for family honour and pride, perhaps. So he says this. Let's use his words. A blamed agent, quotes, may have other dispositions, however, in their S, to which the blame less directly may relate. In particular, they may have a motivation to avoid the disapproval of other people, for instance, to avoid their blame. When a motivation of this kind takes a deeper form than merely the desire to avoid hostility, it can be the ethically important disposition that consists in a desire to be respected by people whom, in turn, one respects. Now, I suggest that that is the most important moment, or one of the most important moments in that paper. And he doesn't give this ethically important disposition a name, perhaps for excellent reasons. Perhaps he didn't want it to be sort of, rarefied and become one of those topics that people discussed and somehow pulled the whole issue out of proportion. But I'm going to give it a name because I think it's profoundly important and it's helpful to have a label. We'll call it the baseline disposition. So, how does proleptic blame work? Well, supposing I'm a person who is an outrageous liar. Maybe I lie to pretty much anyone about anything. I take it totally lightly that I spin yarns and I bullshit and I lie about things when it suits me. And I really didn't have a reason not to lie to my colleague about some professional matter. And he'll say, so he engages in blame, and perhaps unbeknownst to him, it's really proleptic blame he's engaged in. Of course, we never really know what people's reasons are, so the epistemic capacity applies second personally too. But he gets busy blaming me for this outrageous lie. And, you know, maybe it will work. Maybe, like the two scenarios with Owen, maybe actually he just persuades me and I discover I did have a reason all along, because after all, the absence of where there should have been a reason for me not to lie to my colleagues might have been embedded in some other sort of things. Like, I do recognize that in general lying is a bad thing, but I just think of that as an important principle when it comes to family and friends. I just think lying to acquaintances and colleagues, I don't care. I just think that's a sort of significant difference. And yet he persuades me it is not a significant difference. And so he's got some leverage to work with, because after all, I agree that lying is in general bad and can be bad. It's just that I'm making this huge exception with regards acquaintances and colleagues. And so he may succeed. So then he's just persuaded me. And I might have a new item in my essay as a result of his exhortations. But on the other hand, maybe I'm a really hard case, not so beyond blame like the super nasty husband, but I'm a much harder case than, unfortunately, he imagines. And I really don't care much about lying to anyone. But what I do have, if I do have this, if I have the ethically important disposition that consists in a desire to be respected by people whom in turn I respect, him, for instance, I have what I call the baseline disposition, then he's at least got that to work with. And maybe his exhortations and his arguments and efforts of persuasion will gain some initial, as it were, gateway leverage with me just in virtue of that baseline disposition. He's got a much harder job to do, and it's probably going to be a really long conversation. It'll be the end of the academic year before I'm thinking, maybe I shouldn't lie to my colleagues. But that's all he's got to work with. So it's the most basic, simple, as it were, gateway source of normativity to other sorts of reasons which we might be able to persuade each other of. And that's why I think it's worth giving it a label, the baseline disposition. I wondered about calling it the baseline ethical disposition, but perhaps that would seem truistic. So let's just call it the baseline disposition. But in fact, of course, what it's a gateway for is ethical normativity in general. Now, that disposition, though mentioned so briefly in the Internal Reasons and Obscurity of Blame paper, is really what, at least I've come to think, Chapter 4 of Shame and Necessity is all about. In Chapter 4 of Shame and Necessity, he discusses shame and the often, as it were, weakly, thinly understood notion of eidos, ancient Greek for shame. And Williams argues that, in fact, contrary to a lot of interpretation, the Greek notion of shame is much more enriched with elements that we think of as associated with guilt than it is often thought, and that in fact eidos isn't really just shame, it's shame and a lot of aspects of guilt. And the crucial aspects of guilt that are there, he argues, is this disposition, the internalized, semi-abstracted other. And so in being involved in eidos, translated as shame, if I'm rendered ashamed of my outrageous lying, I'm ashamed, not as it were because I've been caught, though maybe a bit of that, but I'm ashamed, if it's a real ethical reaction, a proper reaction of shame, because I've internalized the gaze of my colleagues for real. And I'm shamed before myself, as it were, vis-a-vis this internalized gaze of the other. And he describes this internalized other with the words, conceived as one whose reactions I would respect, and also vice versa. And one of the examples he uses is Ajax's suicide at his own dishonor. And he describes Ajax as unable to go on living because he couldn't look, well, sorry, these aren't his words, this is my gloss, because he couldn't look such a generalized other, but most concretely his father Telamon, in the eye. And these are William's words. He has no way of living that anyone he respects would respect, which means that he cannot live with any self-respect. And this example illustrates and dramatizes what Williams is trying to say about eidos in general, which is that it incorporates this internalized, semi-abstracted view of another. So the internalized gaze is not any rational being, of course, but nor is it just himself, Ajax. It's people around him in his world whose respect he cares about maintaining. That's the gaze that one internalizes and is involved in responses of shame. And that's a good part of responses of guilt feeling in our modern way of thinking. And so what we've seen here, I think, is that this, what I've called the baseline disposition, which is doing so much work in making intelligible the possibility of radically proleptic blame, is what gets writ large as the fundamental ethical attitude also in Shame and Necessity, the internalized gaze of the other, on its own doing quite a lot of persuasive work, even in situations where very little else by way of ethical reasons might be shared of a relevant kind for the persuasion in question. Okay, so we've got the importance in proleptic blame of the baseline disposition as this fundamental sort of gateway to other kinds of ethical normativity, and that was introduced by Williams to explain, render intelligible, make sense of the practice of blaming people when, by the internal reasons theorist lights, they really don't have the reason. They might have other reasons in which it's embedded, so we get leverage with them, or at base we might just have the baseline disposition to work with. So it can make sense. Only in the cases where they don't even have the baseline disposition towards you, the super nasty husband who was falling off our continuum over here, which is why he thought we may think we can blame him. Only in those cases will it just not work, because they don't even have the baseline disposition. And we know that that is often the case in times of war and social collapse, and even when there isn't. There are some people who just don't give a damn about the other person who they're torturing or hurting or betraying. And that can happen. And we say in that situation, they don't even have this basic ethical attitude towards the other whom they're hurting. And that, unfortunately, can be true. Now, theoretically speaking, might one not worry that the same complaint that Williams launched against the external reasons theorists when it comes to, going on to Owen about how he really ought to join up when, surely we've already discovered this is just not one of his reasons, browbeating, coercion in disguise, might we not worry that that returns in relation to the proleptic blamer? I've managed to manufacture in myself a genuine worry of this kind. I didn't used to worry, and then in talks people would say, but aren't you worried about it? Now I am worried. So I'm trying to address it very literally, and I think it's helped me. So here's the worry. This is how I understand what I think is the most kind of crystal version of the worry. The proleptic blamer acts as if there's a sound deliberative route from the blamee's S when X hypothesi. There isn't. So the proleptic blamer effectively disregards their interlocutor's actual reasons, apparently bypassing them in order to change them. So it looks like a sort of trick. The people who worry about certain kinds of blame, especially proleptic blame, involving a sort of trick, treating someone as if they've got a reason and thereby causing them to come to have the reason. It looks like you kind of wave a wand and you actively disregard their current rational state in order to get them into a different one. And, in a way, it's a more acute worry than is often rehearsed in the general literature on blame about, blame that tries to direct other people's behaviours. Looks like kind of a bit of a regulatory stance, the kind of bossy stance to take. Victoria McGeer's work has addressed this really well, I think, about blame that tries to change other people's behaviour. Well, here we've got a kind of blame doesn't try to change others' behaviour directly. It tries to change it by messing with their head, right? Change what their reasons are by ignoring their reasons at first and arguing with them as if they've got the reason, thereby causing them to come to the reason. So it doesn't look like a completely consistent mode of rational engagement with the other. It looks like you rationally engage and you skip a bit and then you come back and hope that the trick worked, as if you suddenly employ mere rhetoric for a moment. So I'd like to dispel this worry. Perhaps I hope you can feel a little bit what I've already said about how proleptic blame really does work, already shows that one isn't just waving a wand or engaging in mere rhetoric. It really does work through the baseline disposition. But I'm going to say some more things along those lines with the aim of normalizing proleptic mechanisms, or helping us see that they are a normal and integral, and indeed, at the end of the day, I want to say an essential and important and productive part of normal efforts of moral persuasion, normal efforts of deliberating about what to do and thereby discovering what one's reasons are. I'll do that first by, again, in a different connection, relating the internal reason stuff to some other area of Williams, in particular the steadying the mind bits of truth and truthfulness. And second, by arguing, perhaps for my own part only, I don't know what Williams would have thought of this, but I want to just argue that we should see ordinary blame and proleptic blame as not distinct kinds of blame at all, but as just placed on a continuum. So again, that's part of my strategy of normalizing proleptic aspects of our moral thinking so that we won't be tempted to worry that proleptic blame in particular is browbeating or a kind of failure of real rational engagement. Okay, so section 3. Yes, I've called it dialogical individualism. I know that one of the things Williams always said, and if I remember rightly, he used to say that his teacher and mentor Gilbert Ryle used to say it, was that one must avoid isms. So I'm failing because I couldn't think of another way of suggesting his view might be called dialogical individualism without using an ism. But anyway, he did use at least one ism in his own work, namely relativism, so maybe that would be all right. I mentioned already that the way he put things in connection with Owen Wingrave, and for a good reason to make a point, was very binaristic. Owen really doesn't have the reason, and he used this phrase on many different occasions in his writing. So really doesn't have the reason. It's not one of his reasons. But I want to suggest that actually that's, though appropriate for the argumentative purposes of those papers, it's actually really quite misleading. It's a philosophical term of art, and I think ultimately it's quite misleading as regards what the view of internal reasons that emerges from his work as a whole is. It picks out, it's useful to pick out the particular, not really a type of case, but a particular conversational moment that we, on the second scenario, presume with Williams that Owen Wingrave has come to, namely that his family have gone on and on for quite some time, maybe hours, maybe days, maybe weeks, trying to persuade him that he really does have reason to join the army for considerations of family honour and pride. But at some point in that effort, all that effort looks good to me so far, is going to involve ordinary efforts of persuasion, perhaps prolepsis. I mean, let's imagine Owen's really quite a hard case and he just doesn't give a damn. He hates the whole thing, hates his family, let's say. Doesn't even buy into any notions of family honour and pride, totally rejects the whole outlook. So we're making pretty hard. So their exhortations will have involved some serious proleptic blame as they castigate him for failing to be responsive to this reason and so on. So let's imagine the whole shebang. At that point, at the end of the conversation, at some point, maybe it's a conversation in real time or maybe it can be a notional idea, only then does it become appropriate to declare Owen really doesn't have a reason, in a way that's meant to kind of silence further attempts to persuade him. It's an idea that one would arrive at the end of a notional or real conversation that we've discovered. He's unpersuadable. We've done it all. We've factored in, we've corrected all the any false beliefs. He's not ignorant of anything. He understands exactly the consequences of his actions. He's been brought to pay proper attention to it all, to imagine the various scenarios, to think of what his grandfather would have thought, etc., etc. But still, he's proved himself unpersuadable vis-a-vis this reason. Only then, I want to suggest, is that the appropriate moment to declare Owen really doesn't have a reason. And then all further attempts look now like browbeating, like coercion in disguise, because proper attempts at persuasion have failed. So what else can it be? And I believe that that's the right way to think about the apparently sort of binaristic way of talking. Not that you could just plucked Owen, you know, before or maybe at the initial stages of that conversation with his family and kind of looked inside his head and said, oh look, Owen, no, you know, he doesn't have a reason, you're not going to get anywhere. That's not the way to think about it. We don't discover our reasons through introspection, and others can't discover our reasons by, as it were, psychological assessment. It's a process, and a process of efforts of persuasion which will have either an outcome of successful persuasion or an outcome of thinking, you know what, he just really doesn't have the reason. Of course, there could be other conclusions. I mean, you might just think, actually, he does, but he's just completely dogmatic and doesn't see it. So then you have to silence yourself for other reasons. But the conclusion that he really doesn't have a reason cannot be reached except notionally at the end point of such an effort of persuasion. That's what I contend. Now, this is somewhat backed up by the other much more dynamic emphases that Williams gives, some in the early paper, but also in later papers. So the binaristic A doesn't have a reason, or X isn't one of A's reasons, can create these sort of false impressions, which Williams tried to correct by saying so, but I think the false impression has somewhat remained. The first false impression, Roman numeral number 1 on your handout, is that the business of finding out what your reasons are is a kind of static, where in fact it's dynamic. So he says this: we must not assume that thinking about the question of what to do, rehearsing considerations and so forth, are simply like perception of an external reality. There's a dynamic process involved. And of course, it's not only that it's not a perception of an external reality, nor is it a perception of an internal reality. We can't just introspect and find out. It's always to be determined. And one of the reasons, one of the dimensions of this dynamicness that I want to bring out here is the involvement of the imagination, which I emphasize he did say in the earlier paper too, but it gets a lot of emphasis later on in the Obscurity of Blame paper. 4 roles for the imagination, at least, are mentioned by Williams. One is that the imagination is involved in deliberation because we need often to find a very specific practical form of an option which we've so far only envisaged in a kind of general form. So if we stick with the Owen example, though I'm sure I'll run out at some point, but the Owen example, we might think that Owen might manage to think of serving family honour and pride in some other way and counter-persuade his family that, you know, this will do. Perhaps he becomes an army doctor or does something else. Second one is, quotes, the invention of alternatives. Well, that can be a different thing from finding a specific form of something general. Owen might just manage to think of a totally different sort of profession that fits the bill. Perception of unexpected similarities. Yes, it's very often ethical deliberation, Williams emphasizes, can be like aspect perception. Maybe Owen's own deliberations in dialogue with his family will allow him to see that he's somewhat like one of his, male ancestors who was a military hero, but in some other respect, not in terms of military prowess, but maybe in terms of, I don't know, leadership or some other thing. And then fourthly, the imagination is exercised in deliberation as when you break out of a dilemma by envisaging some totally different course of action altogether. Goodness knows what Owen could have done there. Maybe he joins the priesthood or something. I don't know. I said I'd run out of examples for Owen, but these are different ways in which the imagination is clearly involved in deliberation and that Williams flagged up for us and which help us see what's involved in the discovery of one's reasons being a highly dynamic process, a process that happens in real time, rather than a kind of perception of any kind, a static perception of any kind. Okay, second misleading aspect of the binaristic turns of phrase, has or doesn't have a reason, is that it can make us think that deliberators are not changed by their own deliberation. And Williams emphasized this very clearly in terms of the business of deliberating, changing one. I talked at the beginning about how we can it need not only be a process of discovery, you've got an item in your S that you didn't have. It can be that new features come into your S as a result of thinking about the world, thinking imaginatively about consequences and so on. The internalist account's reference to arising at a conclusion by a sound deliberative route has to be taken in an idealized or abstract form. He's lamenting this. It unfortunately ends up being taken in an idealized or abstract form. That's the business of philosophy. That's how we talk. But this leaves out the distinctive psychological effects of the actual process of deliberation. So that's in Values, Reasons and the Theory of Persuasion, where he particularly emphasizes that aspect, if you like. It's not just that the view of the world and its moral saliences, ethical saliences gets changed in deliberation. It's that actually kind of who you are. There's a kind of existential change through that process of deliberation, or there can be. The third misleading aspect of the binaristic way of talking is that it can lead one to think that the question of what one's reasons are is fully determinate. And Williams emphasized in many different places just how indeterminate the question of having a sound deliberative route is, and therefore the question of what my internal reasons are is going to be indeterminate too. So even in the early paper he said this: And he's considering an objection that it's, quotes, unclear what the limits are to what an agent might arrive at by rational deliberation from his existing S. And then Williams continues with the reply, it is unclear, and I regard it as a basically desirable feature of a theory of practical or practical reasoning that it should preserve and account for that unclarity. There is an essential indeterminacy in what can be counted a rational deliberative process. Practical reasoning is a heuristic process and an imaginative one, and there are no fixed boundaries on the continuum from rational thought to inspiration and conversion. Now there's a couple of words, inspiration and conversion. One often thinks of those words as connected with sort of McDowell's attempt to ask, can there be external reasons, as if they're the sorts of things that Williams might reject or need to reject. But he doesn't, because his whole conception of what deliberation looks like will involve these sorts of things. Fourth way in which the binaristic way of talking can be a bit misleading is it can lead us to think that Williams conceived of what I described at the beginning as important fact that he thought we individuals are the authors of our own ends. Nothing can stop us being the authors of our own ends, not people banging on the table, not people pointing to all the family portraits going up the stairs. You're the author of your own ends and therefore of your own ethical reasons. And that can encourage the idea that he was an individualist in other senses, that he had a sort of atomistic conception of us as social subjects and agents. But of course, he didn't at all. But that didn't become, exactly what his view about that was and how radically social the determination of our reasons is, even while we remain the only authors of them, didn't become clear to me until I started connecting what he says in Truth and Truthfulness by way of studying the mind with the whole business of how reasons are determined in the first place. So this is the last kind of loop to later work that I think really casts a different light on the earlier statements. In Truth and Truthfulness, there's that bit where he's discussing Diderot's character of Rameau's nephew. And if you remember, Rameau's nephew is someone who barely counts as having any beliefs at all. We can imagine him as a kind of mercurial socialite who just kind of says amusing things and whatever passes through his mind. He'll just say stuff to please, to amuse. He's just a person of no substance whatever, no commitments, no nothing. He's just kind of amusing. And what this throws up for Williams is there's a general picture of the mind that he attributes to Diderot, but that he argues for in his own voice, which is that actually human beings, we are perpetually engaged in dialogical processes through which our minds are steadied. That's to say, Williams thinks of us as entertaining all sorts of propositions without any determinate attitude attached. He calls these wishes. And it's only through trustful dialogue with others that we settle these wishes into steadied states of beliefs on the one hand, desires on the other. But of course, the desire category will contain many other sorts of things, all the sorts of things that might be in RS, for instance. And so what he says about trustful conversation and the setting of the mind there, here's one little clip that captures it, I think, and it's in connection specifically with beliefs. The subject is engaged in trustful conversation with another who relies on him, and the question is whether he can give that person to believe the proposition. In doing that, he may well, in such a case, give himself to believe it as well. It's the presence and needs of others that help us to construct even our factual beliefs. And this of course, is a sort of, in a way, a reiteration of the Edward Craigian conception of the epistemic state of nature that book, Truth and Truthfulness, begins with, which is that here we all are. To survive and to flourish, we need to be able to survive. We need to be able to have the benefit not only of our own eyes and ears, the beliefs we can get from our own senses, but also to be able to rely on others. So we need to be able to we need to be in a situation where virtues or proto-virtues of accuracy and sincerity are encouraged so that we can have a kind of functional practice of pooling information. Well, in a way, this Diderotian construction of relying on others to steady our minds is a more abstracted reiteration of that general social conception of how we come to have the beliefs that we have. And I think Williams thought of this, it's not that all our beliefs are indeterminate, except for when we're in discussion. It's that, as it were, there's a rolling business of what we believe. Somebody asks us for information and we look and see and we try and give them the best we can, and we ask ourselves whether we persuade them. We say, oh yeah, that is the case. That is the time. It is good weather. We're in Lund. So this is how we come to confirm what we believe. But then he says, in a little teeny paragraph all of its own, but didn't for reasons of his own purposes in that chapter, he didn't follow this up here. He says, it's a further implication of Diderot's picture of the mind that similar factors can help us to construct our desires. If we consider what's involved in this, it can give us also a deeper insight than we've so far had into the nature of wishful thinking. And then he takes the conversation in the direction of wishful thinking, because that's his purpose in the chapter. But what I want to do is pluck out this little paragraph and say, oh yes, let's just do that. Let's just see what desires look like when we think of them on this Diderotian picture that Williams recommends. Well, what does it look like? It's not like looking out the window and saying, yes, it's sunny, or looking at your watch and telling the other person the time. You're engaged in trustful dialogue about what to believe and what to care about ethically. Which is more important, we might say? Not lying to your colleagues, or whatever. Which is more important? Which of my values do I really want to prioritize here? Work or family? Managing not to lie or avoiding hurt. We discuss those things either with an imagined interlocutor in our own heads, but for the most part, in real space, across real social space and in real time with others. And it's going to have to be others whom we respect, right? Others towards whom we have the baseline disposition, and ideally they would have it towards us too, because we're in the domain of trying to think about values together in a context of valuing the other's respect. If we didn't have the value of the other, we didn't have that baseline disposition, I'm not sure what sort of persuasive force their views about whether to prioritize not hurting someone or honesty in a particular circumstance would really have. So it's going to be distinctive of applying the Diderotian picture to the dialogical construction of desires, that the dialogue isn't just with, as it were, it's not just trustful conversation in the epistemic sense, but it's ethically enriched conversation in the sense of the baseline disposition being present too. And so what this little moment of, if you like, synthetic elaboration on my part amounts to is that I think what Williams might have gone on to say about the steadying of the mind's relevance to what it is to have a reason is that our basic practical reasons come already from this process that is dialogical conversation with others towards whom we share the baseline disposition. And through that, certain sorts of wishes get settled into desires, commitments, ethical attitudes, like thinking one sort of value is more important than another sort of value. And it's through that steadying process that we come to have our internal reasons in the first place. And so they are putting back in the system how dynamic it all is. Of course, we don't just fix our internal reasons and then we're stuck with them. It's continued, they're always provisional, and that dialogue is always continuing. And so they're always, in a way, to be determined, except at the notional end of the conversation, when the family has persuaded you and exhorted you and done all their best and pointed to the portraits on the wall, and at the end of that conversation, then it's time to declare, okay, this person is unpersuadable. Their mind is really, as it were, steadied in a fixed way now on this issue, and I think anything beyond this is going to be browbeating. And what it means is the conclusion that you should shut up now and not carry on with the exhortations and the efforts to persuade is really a sort of a vague matter of first-order ethical injunction. When do genuine, respectful, honest attempts to persuade, even through prolepsis, stop and mere browbeating begin? There isn't going to be a rule for that, because there's no fixed fact of the matter as whether they have the reason or they don't. It's just, as it were, that the conversation has run out and it's unreasonable to persist at this time. And so I think our whole idea about whether Owen has the reason or not needs to be understood in the light of this business of steadying the mind as the fundamental process through which anyone comes to have a reason anyway. And so proleptic persuasions are already involved in that natural business of how it is to come to have a reason. And so that's really the discovery, if it is a discovery, at least it seems like a discovery to me, that what my reasons are always, on William's view, to be determined. And the business of me just not having a reason has to be understood in this end of the conversation sense, and not in, as it were, a declaration about my psychology prior to genuine efforts to persuade me. And I think I should probably stop there. So I'll leave the blaming and the proleptic blaming being one and the same for another occasion. But this general picture of his view as internal reasons having provisional and to be determined status is really what I want to leave you with. And the notion of authorship of our ends, I do think, is really fundamental to Williams being a philosopher of freedom. And we do miss how important that freedom was to him, I think, because of his views of freedom of the will being a essentially superficial problem. He thought with Nietzsche that we should be superficial out of profundity when it comes to the question of freedom of the will, and instead he wanted to emphasize, this voluntary action, the domain of things, of our deeds, of things that we do and that we cause, and we are responsible for that. But actually, not freedom of the will, but freedom in this other sense of authorship of our ends is absolutely fundamental. So I think so that's how I read him. Thank you very much.
Miranda, thanks very much. I'll just take the mic back and forth as we go and just pass it on.
Thank you very much for a wonderfully rich paper. I wanted to offer you first a bit more material to think about from the ancient world. One of the recurrent themes in ancient literature, in the tragic poets and in Homer too, is the supplication scene, where someone supplicates to someone else for the sparing of their life, or to be allowed back into the city, or to be allowed to bury a relative, or whatever it may be. One of the most famous of these scenes is in Book 21 of the Iliad, between Lycaon and Achilles. And what Lycaon says to Achilles, I think, is extremely interesting for your purposes. He says, "Feel eidos towards me, and have pity." That's his plea. And what he means by feel eidos towards me, feel shame towards me, as far as I can see, is not what perhaps a superficial reader of Nietzsche might think. He's not saying, be embarrassed by my weakness and the contrast between my weakness and your strength. He's saying, understand that we're both vulnerable to the gods, and before the gods we're both pretty much helpless. You could be in my plight as much as I could be in your position. Feel eidos towards me. Have a sense of the due bounds of moral action here. Have a sense, it's like shame in the ameliorative sense that we use it in describing people as shameless. It's that kind of shame. It's a proper sense of the limits of your action. So I do recommend that passage to you, because I think there's lots of material there for your thesis. I can't remember whether Williams discusses it, right. But Iliad 21, 64 following.
Thank you. And, well, I'll ask you later, but I'll also write it down. Thank you. Yes, I don't recall him discussing it either, but
we need to go cross-disciplinary here, because there must be a big literature in classical studies on supplication scenes, because it's a huge theme.
And
I don't know the literature either.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I mean, the question of, I don't think, Williams definitely brings up pity in many places in Truth and Truthfulness, but I feel like we've sort of totally lost that moral notion. Pity now in a sort of in a modern ethical conversation, it's only heard negatively normally and as condescension, but the notion of pity seems to be just the right, taking away the condescension, just the right attitude to have in cases of moral luck. Because I've often wondered, I think he had good reason not to invoke that word, but I wish there were a word we could invoke, because it would help us understand what bystanders' attitudes might be towards, say, the lorry driver who is blameless but yet has caused this terrible thing. And I've often wondered what the second personal counterpart to the first personal response of responsibility for bad luck moral cases might be, and pity looks like a really good candidate. It's just that we don't have a word that has the right resonances these days.
I absolutely agree, and the historic link between piety and pity is interesting here, because the original thought, and this is very much the thought in Homer and the ancient Greeks, is that we're vulnerable before Zeus. So there's a theological dimension to it. But it should be absolutely obvious, despite the disparagement of pity by some atheist critics, you don't have to be a theist to have the sense that we're all vulnerable in the world and that we share our vulnerability. You don't have to be a theist to have that thought. No. And I think it's a crucial ethical thought.
Yeah, thanks.
Lawrence, what did you?
Oh, yes.
I'm going to work my way around. I've got clusters, so I'm going to try and so that I don't have to hop around too much.
Well, thanks very much for this. This sounds pretty agree on everything you've said. And I wanted to know your opinion about one point in particular. I agree with you about the idea that the basic practical reasons come from this dialogic process of conversation with others, and that process is dynamic. And I also like the fact that you quote Williams, Internal Reasons and Spirit of Blame, when he says that people might have a motivation to avoid the disapproval of other people, for instance, to avoid the blame, and ethical important disposition that consists in the desire to be respected by people whom in turn one respects. Now, this sounds to me pretty similar to what the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith say about the formation of the reasons we have and the relations we have with other people. In particular, I'm thinking about Hume, Treatise, Book 2, Part 1, if I remember correctly, and Adam Smith in particular, the Theory of Moral Sentiment, Part 7, Section 2, Chapter 4, where he says that I want to be worth of, basically, when I'm proud of myself, I want to be recognized by people whom I recognize as worthy of my good opinion of them. And I was wondering what you think about that. Do you think that Williams was influenced by that tradition of thought as well? I mean, because, for example, Sophie Grace mentioned like the classical thought, which is pretty present there in Williams. But what about the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers? Do you have any opinion about that?
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree. One finds this, if you like, economy of esteem these in sentimentalist ethics, and Adam Smith. I'm a big fan of Adam Smith, and I haven't noticed Williams alluding to Smith much or any footnotes. I don't. So maybe there will be somewhere, but it hasn't leapt out at me. But he's often very explicitly Humean, and in fact, I remember some lectures that he gave in Oxford when I was a graduate student, where he was talking about. I remember him talking, this bit in effect. I remember him talking about, as it were, how it all sort of gets going is that, I care about your respect for me and you care about my respect for you, and he was talking about that specifically in connection with Hume. So I imagine that he would have been happy with the thought that he was drawing this from a Humean line of thought, absolutely, and would have been happy to be explicit about it. I just never noticed him alluding to Smith, but Smith, we're reading Smith a lot more these days, I'm happy to say, and it may just be that people weren't thinking about Smith so much at that time, and so it didn't seem quite so in the air, but I think of pretty much everything that Smith says as highly conducive to pretty much everything Williams wanted to say. The general idea, it stands to reason the whole meta-ethics is there. The general sentimentalist meta-ethics is, I think, what is going on in Williams' non-objectivism about morals. But maybe he had reasons for not wanting to go for that ism. He did always, I think for good reasons, not want to line up. And I don't mean that he therefore kind of sidelined alliance, as it were, lines of inheritance, but I think he probably just thought that they would mislead. So I'm sure he wouldn't have liked to just say, yeah, I'm a sentimentalist. He's like, well, it doesn't all line up. I think, you can have moral knowledge. Yes, there's the relative and the distance applies, and yet you can apply your thick ethical concepts in your own culture and thereby say morally true things and have moral knowledge. He just was a much more piecemeal philosopher, because I think any ism tended to line him up with things that he thought weren't true. So I imagine that's why he will have chosen not to be terribly explicit about. Even the Humeanism, he mentions Hume often to differentiate his view from Hume, as well as to show similarities. So I think, I respect the reasons that he did that, but actually I think you're quite right to see it as all very much in line with the sentimentalist tradition.
last shot over here, and then I'll migrate over to that side.
Thank you. So it was very interesting. I wanted to ask you about this element of indeterminacy that you pointed out. So ex ante, maybe one could say that it's neither true nor false that Owen has or doesn't have a reason, but then after a long period of persuasion and unsuccessful persuasion, we can conclude that he's unpersuadable. To some extent, I guess we can conclude that, but we haven't, we never exhaust all possibilities of inspiration and conversation. So I guess that perhaps one could argue that it's never fully determinate whether Owen has a reason or not. But what I wanted to ask you about is the case where, well, suppose we manage to persuade Owen, right? But if the conversation went in a different way, well, he wouldn't be persuaded. So he does have a reason just because we have persuaded him, but he wouldn't have a reason otherwise. I'm not sure about this this situation. That so it seems that in a way the claims that someone has a reason has a stronger position than those that he doesn't have a reason, but shouldn't be symmetrical, though, in a sense, right? Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm really tempted. I don't know what Williams would have thought, but I'm really tempted by this radically more. I mean, I don't know how radical it is. I was about to say this radical thesis that, you know, it's never fully determined what our reasons are. Maybe that's just normal. Maybe that's what most of us. Maybe it's only philosophy that's somehow got us to think that the kind of normal default idea is that is terribly determinate and definite, that at time t, these are my reasons. Maybe that's the fiction that we're trying to sort of relax away from. I mean, maybe if we hadn't, people who hadn't done so much philosophy, they wouldn't find it at all surprising to say, well, yeah, maybe I'll be persuaded this way. And I think Williams, he certainly needn't have minded. I believe he probably wouldn't have minded the idea that, you know, at the end of the day, we have to be mainly guided by what people will actually do and what they're actually acting on when they do it. those are the reasons. Those are their reasons now. And so even while he begins with this more counterfactual style of spelling out the idealization, I think it's right to then head to the ground and say, well, look, there are these real processes in real time of real conversations with others, some who will have more power and less power, more rhetorical power and less power, and they'll be able to persuade you not just because they're presenting good reasons, but also because of who they are and how you're bonded to them. So I emphasized very much the baseline disposition, which means that you're persuadable in principle, you're amenable to their exhortations. But of course, I don't think Williams would have been against the adding in more to the picture that, of course, you know, who we're more easily persuaded by, that's a pretty messy business. You know, more persuaded by someone who's got more power, more persuaded by someone who you are more attached to than another. Yes, the persuadability is a lot to do with who you sort of personally care about, as well as your more impartial things that you care about because you think that this value is more important than this value in these sorts of circumstances. So I think, I'd like to think he'd have been okay with the implications of saying that at the end of the day, what your reasons are is a question of what you can be persuadable of in ordinary circumstances, where we acknowledge that the ordinary circumstances are pretty messy. And you know, with some people you'll be persuadable and others you might prove less persuadable or it'll take longer. And so the whole thing does stay not pinned down, you know, but it will be, there's determinacy in the system because people will do stuff and they will do it for these reasons and not those, and then that's how we live and that's how we cope and we persuade each other on that basis. But I think we probably just need to live with those indeterminacies. Yeah. Thank you.
Steve, you want to say something for a while?
Miranda, thanks a lot for this. So this is following up on the Smith thing, but taking it in a somewhat different direction. And I want to set it up with something Aristotle says at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics when he's considering, you know, there are these three possible answers to what eudaimonia is pleasure, virtue, and honor. He says, we can tell right away it can't be honor because people care about more being honored by some people than by others. And what could explain this? He says, well, what explains this is that we trust the judgment of the people who we honor more. And what we want is to be honorable, and that turns out to be his answer of virtue. Similarly, Smith points out that what we care about is not just being respected, but being proper objects of respect. That is, being respect-worthy. We care not just about being loved, but being lovely. We care about being respectable in that sense of a fitting object of respect. And so I wonder if this doesn't have more subversive implications for Williams. Or I think he should welcome these implications. I think you think he should welcome these implications. I think he should welcome these implications. That what we get from others we respect is a view of ourselves as we would wish to be, where the thought is not just that we want their respect, either just because we want to be, for instrumental reasons, or even because we want to be connected to them, but because we're giving them a kind of authority to see us in a certain way. And then it turns out that the object, the baseline disposition, is not just to be respected by people we respect, but to be worthy of respect, to be fitting objects of it.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's marvelously difficult territory, this, isn't it? Because he needs to be careful that the notion of the distinction between mere respect and being, and as it were, earning respect doesn't then take off into a more external domain or some kind of objectivism about what is respect worthy that he doesn't want to go to. And I think, I'm not saying you are taking it there, but so I think I agree with you. He can welcome that distinction, and he will need to find it within the ordinary practice of what earned respect. So the distinction that when he describes the baseline disposition, he distinguishes it as he's at pains to distinguish it from, other sorts of not ethical attitudes, like just being scared of the response, not wanting to be blamed. And I think he would welcome the distinction you're pointing to, and by putting the kind of mere trappings of respect side of the contrast in with wanting to secure favour and wanting to avoid being shouted at, etc. That's not what he calls an ethical disposition at all. It becomes an ethical disposition when you're in this normative domain of feeling that it's earned. So I think that's where he would need to welcome exactly that distinction, and I agree. It's just some formulations of it would be unfriendly to his position, because you can imagine someone arguing that you can't really get this distinction between mere respect and as it were, the real thing, unless you invoke something more objective. But I think I think one doesn't need to. Yeah.
Crucial idea that if he wants to hold on to, I think we should want to hold on in this area, is that the value has to be psychologically accessible, and we have to be able to appreciate it in our own motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt.
I think the answer to my question was implicit in the prior question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying I think the answer to my question is implicit in the prior question, but I'll go ahead and pitch it anyway.
Steve has already answered. I'll just say what he said.
So I was thinking that it might be the case that what makes proleptic blame apt is the prospect of bringing somebody to have the right kind of reason for, say, refraining from action. And that's going to mean that it might not be enough that I'm interested in the respect of somebody that I respect. And so here's what I was thinking. If I mistreat you and I respect you and I want your respect, then it might be that I can come to see that I have a reason to refrain from that kind of treatment that's based on my respect for you and my sense of your own standing. But if I mistreat Paul and I don't respect Paul, and I don't care about whether Paul respects me, I might still have a reason for refraining from mistreating him that's grounded in my respect for you, but then that seems like the wrong kind of reason. I'm interested in impressing you, and it has to do with your standing rather than his. Yes. And so, but building in something like, well, I want to be a fitting object of your respect would be the way to...
Yes, thank you. No, I quite agree. And this connects a bit with the sort of section I didn't have time for. I mean, when I was thinking about you know, the reason. I don't know, what reasons do we act on? There's a whole bunch, there's a whole sort of hierarchy of reasons that are in there. And I was thinking about a reason to think of apparently non-proleptic blame and radically proleptic blame as on a continuum, rather than as two different types of blame, which is how they first appeared to me to be anyway, is that, you know, when blame is quick and easy, and I'm just blaming you for a reason you've absolutely got, and you immediately say, oh yeah, sorry, I shouldn't have done that, or whatever, it looks like there's no prolepsis happening. But in fact, I am drawing you back into a more full endorsement of that very reason. So we kind of stray somewhat from our reasons quite a lot of the time, either through acrasia or forgetfulness or bad judgment or whatever. And we need blamers to bring us back into the right kind of endorsement of those reasons, so we recognise again that this is more important than that, and we prioritise better, and so on. Proleptic blame does that, but with knobs on, as it were. We bring people all the way back in, and there the difference is that the only leverage we've got is the baseline disposition. But even right up here with the quick and easy blame, when you blame me for reasons I've kind of already got, it couldn't get anywhere without the baseline disposition. So that is still in there, and you just described just that you know, when you act in a way that's, you do something for someone else and it's done with the right sort of reason, the baseline disposition of respecting their respect for you and caring about it is already in there, and absent that, it would be a very different sort of action. So although we might act for sort of proximal, highly specific reasons a lot of the time, you do a thing to make someone happy, the baseline disposition is always in there anyway in doing some work. It's just what's distinctive about extremely proleptic cases is that none of the more specific reasons or even fairly general principles are there. Only the baseline disposition is what you've got to work with. And so, yeah. So I was just thinking that in the example as you described it, you were invoking the idea that one might go in for an act of kindness or an act of respect because of the baseline disposition. But of course, normally there's all stacks of much more specific reasons to do the kind or the respectful thing. But the baseline disposition is always in there. So I just wanted to agree with that general thought. Yeah, and so I think we are in the domain of right reasons in the broad. Yeah.
This entire row lit up at one point. The first one I saw was Adrian, so I did it, and then it can move around, and then there's a question after.
Thank you, and thank you, Miranda. I've got a point which is going to sound like an objection, but actually I think it's not.
Bet it is.
No,
I bet
think
it
it's
is.
not. I think it's actually very conducive, because I think it fits in with the continuum idea in the part of the paper that that you didn't actually give us this morning, but it has to do with the basic worry that initiates this whole discussion. The worry is the worry that you say has often been voiced in the past when you've given similar presentations, is that proleptic blame looks as if it's just another form of browbeating. And then the thought is, do we not now have the opposite worry, that proleptic blame is now beginning to look as if it's just another form of ordinary blame? Precisely because of the baseline disposition, which after all is characterized as a desire. So is there anything distinctive about it at all? I mean, are we not in a way back at square one? But as I say, I suspect that that's in fact not an objection to your position. You're going to say, yes, that's precisely the point that emerges in this idea of a continuum of cases.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it is, and so I'm not even sure that what the back at square one would be, if you know what I mean. The worry is this prolepsis business totally weird and not a genuine form of eye-to-eye rational engagement? And then it turns out that it's just built in from the start, and that I think we have so then the back at square one worry could be all of blame looks browbeating. So that would be quite an extreme position, but one could see how one could generate it. But that's where I think particularly the arguments about steadying the mind come in to say, no, this really would be the wrong construal of what it is, because actually it's good for human beings to determine what they think. And we determine what we think and value through dialogue. And actually, that form of dialogue is always rendering provisionally more determinate that which previously was less determinate, or changing our minds might be from one determinacy to another determinacy after all. And so the normalization is so deep by that stage, that then I think I would challenge anyone to be worried about blame looking like it's this kind of regulatory, trying to kind of bash people about their head and change them. It's the only way for us to have psychological lives is for us to engage in one another, look at the world, try and figure out what to think, look at values, try and figure out which things to prioritize, what's more important than what, and all that is part of this steadying process. And all of it is a perpetual process of shifting and rendering more determinate. So I think, so thank you. So perhaps that's the bit of the argument that is not merely a kind of normalizing move, but normalizing in such a radical way that the objector's left with nothing to worry about. Thank you.
Thank you. I found the reconstruction both compelling and helpful, but I have two minor concerns about that worry that you address, about blame being browbeating in disguise. One is that this kind of worry, I think, is going to rise much more broadly on just about any Williamsian account of our practices, and whether the sort of strategy that you pursue in answering or diffusing the worry succeeds will depend on whether the addressee adheres to what Williams calls the attitude of purity in ELP. Here's why. I mean, in the essay on persuasion, I think he has this wonderful passage where he discusses a idealized Habermasian conception of rational discourse or human rational dealings, and contrasts it with persuasion or conversion. And then he says that his picture is one on which, if you like, everything is persuasion, and the question is which forms of it we are willing to accept. And that is partly an ethical and political question. And given that Williamsian picture, on the one hand, just about any Williamsian account of a practice is going to show that it involves certain forms of merely causal or psychological or contingent influences. And that's going to mean that this worry will arise across the board. And the other thing is that whether the person will be convinced by the kind of strategy you pursue, which is to basically to show that blame is actually not that bad because proleptic blame is not that bad because all of blame is a bit proleptic, and even studying the mind, having reasons in the first place, involves those forces that Williams brings out. Given that, it's the purist attitude will insist on contrasting all of that with a very idealized conception of how rational dealing should be, whereas Williams invites us to draw a more internal contrast, as it were. As you do indeed, and you pursue this internal contrast. So my worry is that if someone isn't on board with redrawing the contrast between acceptable and unacceptable forms of human dealings within a contingent, psychologically pervaded world, then they're not going to be persuaded by this strategy because they have overblown normative expectations. They expect this pure thing.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with that picture of the dialectical situation. I think it's true that, you know, already happened with our exchanges a little bit, that I was at pains to situate Williams in a context where he wouldn't end up getting drawn into, well, it's, you know, the persuasion counts as okay, or the respect is earned if some, you know, in a ideal speech situation, that's how it would go, or I agree that that's off the agenda, and he regards those opponents as having no leg to stand on. I mean, I don't think he thought that the dialectical situation was that the onus of proof was on those who want to make the internal distinction. I think the argumentative job to be done is to, as it were, keep using philosophy to look at the distinctions between browbeating and okay persuasion, between earned respect and mere trappings of respect, between, you know, what to have a good reason and a less good reason, and keep firming up those sorts of imminent distinctions, if you like, and then hope that the temptation or the allure of something notionally more objective than that goes away. And this isn't a kind of philosophy of therapy idea. It's a doing the work of, you know, if we build up, what distinctions have we got between objective and subject? Well, plenty. Our factual beliefs need to be okay. Our reasoning needs to be okay in the instrumental, in its instrumental credentials. That's already quite a lot. So far, so Hume. But then we've got this business of exercising the imagination and so on. We can, I mean, my interest in issues of epistemic injustice is connected in this regard, because attempts at persuasion, of course, they can not only go wrong because errors of fact or instrumental reasoning are going wrong, and they can not only go wrong because of explicit attempts that are clearly coercive and bashing shoes on the head. They can go wrong because the reason she's so easily persuaded by him is because he's a man, because he's senior, because he's whatever it may be. And these are dysfunctions in the ordinary business of persuasion, which I think need to be dealt with piecemeal to see it better not look like this, it better not look like that, or the reason he can't make his point is because these guys don't share that concept, but there's a reason why they don't share that concept. That's what I've thought of as hermeneutical injustice. That and many other different ways that can make the speech situation go wrong need to be increasingly drawn out, I think. And once you get a rich enough picture of avoiding all those vices, maybe we think, well, so long as it's none of those things, it's kind of okay persuasion. And maybe it'll always remain impure, good, you know, because we might still realize that actually this kind of persuasion seems a bit off color because of blah, blah, blah. This might be something we develop in the future, a new sense of vice in the system. But I think for that reason, a conclusion to draw is that we need lots more philosophy of this kind of immanentist kind, helping us think in a substantive, often sort of first order as well as second order way about what attempts at persuasion are not okay and why. And I think we can do all of that without having to allude to some kind of purist idea, which I too find very attractive, but actually ultimately sort of incoherent. And part of the urgency of philosophers still doing that sort of work is that I think that the allure of the purist conception of things is exactly the same as the allure as the nihilist conception of things. That, you know, it's an old point, but the kind of postmodernist, ultra-relativist shrugging of shoulders conclusion, you know, all operations of reason are just power, all operations of persuasion are sort of mere rhetoric, it's just power, there's nothing else. That leads, you know, to a very bad place. It's conservative. And so that's a different sort of reason for avoiding the allure of the pure, because, you know, you look at the purist picture and then you see, if you do, that it can't work, and then it all comes crashing down. So you get that characteristic philosophical disillusionment that drives ultra-relativist programs. And I'm sure we're due another dose of them soon. I mean, maybe postmodernism's kind of over, but, you know, I'm sure it'll come back in another way. And maybe it comes back as fake news. I mean, maybe it comes back in a different place, and it's a real problem. So I think I've probably said enough, but I'm really all for reckoning with the real attractions of a more purist, more objectivist conception, so long as we don't have enough going on and not enough philosophy going on to help us see what kinds of persuasions aren't. That's where the work needs to continue to be done, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. I thought that was rather fantastic. So this is really very trivial thing, unlike many of the previous questions. But I thought there was one thing that you said that I didn't think was quite right, and you didn't need to say that. And what I have in mind is the point you made about the binary or binaristic declaration, you know, or it has a reason or it doesn't have a reason. You said that declarations of those forms should be understood as appropriate only at the end of the dialogical working out. So that, I think, is not true. I mean, I think so-and-so has a reason, so-and-so doesn't have a reason, can appear at many other stages in the dynamic process of thinking about what we have reasons to do. So, for instance, you know, you might say to yourself, I have a reason to do this, when you're quite uncertain about, or whether, when you don't want to do that thing that you have reason to do. Or the sort of opposite kind of case. I mean, I'm spending too much time teaching. Should I spend less time teaching and do my research? Do I have reason to care this much about my students? I might say, well, I really don't have. That can come sort of earlier in the stage. But you don't. In any case, you don't have to say. You don't have to make that claim about when these declarations of these forms are appropriate. What you need to say, I think, is that expressions like so-and-so has a reason, so-and-so doesn't have a reason, doesn't often and certainly needn't have the descriptive function of describing what the target, what reasons the target has, but can have various other performative functions. And so it felt like when you said, look, that declaration should be only appropriate at the end of the discourse, I thought you were conceding too much to the people you're opposing. I mean, you should sort of reject the more general assumption that these utterances are constative or descriptive in the main. In fact, these utterances can be used to perform very many divergent kind of speech acts, which serve different purposes at different stages of reason giving or reason building.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really helpful. I'm sure that's right to emphasize that, saying that someone does or doesn't have a reason to FI can serve many purposes. And perhaps I should be clearer in emphasizing that the kind of case is one that I'm thinking needs to be taken only as a kind of the declaration you can make at the end of an actual or notional long conversation is when there's a sort of really doesn't have a reason about it, when it's stated as a reason to declare that any continued efforts to persuade now just are over the top, count as browbeating or coercive, because normal efforts of persuasion have been exhausted. I suppose I think it's the material about steadying the mind that is most useful here to sort of supply both my agreement with you that someone has a reason, someone doesn't have a reason, somebody has a belief, they don't have a belief. Of course we should talk that way. It's not like we always have to say yet. But in a sense, there's always a yet in there because it's all provisional. So we go around with pretty determinate beliefs and some pretty determinate reasons, some pretty determinate dispositions, loyalties, baseline disposition being the most stable of them all, perhaps. And it's not like that whole thing has suddenly been exploded and shown to be indeterminate. On the contrary, what's been shown, I think, is that these states and commitments have a certain sort of fundamental provisionality about them because they're always subject to potential change through trustful dialogue. And then, as it were, over and above that point, internal reasons have special sorts of indeterminacies because of how sort of controversial they are. Which thing is more valuable? We hit controversy so easily when it comes to value. Is this more important than that? And that's when, you're in a sort of almost dilemma type case where real like, God, I don't know what to do. My family's pressurizing me to do this, and yet there are these other reasons, and I hate the whole thing. That's a situation where it becomes really important not to talk in terms of what reason someone does or doesn't have. It's not enough to just think of them as sort of provisional, doesn't have the reason yet. It's a really substantive business to try and get him to a state where he has determinate reasons. So yeah, so I absolutely agree with what you said, and I think so I hope that helps. That in a way my comments about indeterminacy are more they're more to be understood as applying in a fairly focused way to sort of difficult, where the values in questions are up for discussion, but they do apply across the board, but only in the sense of showing we have a kind of rolling provisionality about these states. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Hi. Yeah. Yes, I'll be quick. Thank you very much. I had a question on the baseline disposition, and I think I wanted to better understand the role it has in the view. So in particular, if it works as a sort of condition of possibility for me to reopening the deliberation process, taking into account your point of view because you are a person that is worth me doing that, or whether it's a more specifically reason generating, something like the disposition itself generates a reason for me to do the things that you prompt me to do.
Thank you. I think it's the first thing. In terms of my understanding of what job Williams intends it to do, I understand it as this, what I call a sort of gateway disposition of openness to persuasion, openness in principle. I can have the baseline disposition towards you and you towards me, but we may never agree ethically about a certain issue, but we'll be, as it were, amenable and open to persuasion towards each other because of the baseline. I mean, this is merely a verbal point. I mean, he just names, I've named baseline disposition, this ethical attitude that he spends a sentence to kind of to describe in terms of my caring about your respect for me. That explains my amenability to your protestations, but it doesn't guarantee that I will actually ever agree with you, but it means I'm ready to engage. So,
and if you do agree with me, you don't end up joining the army, for example, because you respect me. You join the army because
yes,
you see my point of view.
Thank you. Exactly. So what you're, if I'm Owen, what you're trying to, you're my mum, you're trying to persuade me, right? And this is the scenario where you do successfully persuade me, and we're ruling out epistemic injustices and other kinds of sneaky coercions or some ideological thing or some false beliefs you're sneaking in to help your case. This is an honest piece of persuasion. And my priorities in terms of caring about family honour and my anti-militarism get kind of switched, so I come to care about family honour enough to overcome my anti-militarism, and I think, okay, you know, and I am actually changed by it. So the substance, this is a bit like what I was sort of trying to say in connection with you, the substance of the persuasion is going to, you know, must be by the end of the argument that I'm persuaded by some bunch of reasons that are much more specific than the baseline disposition. It's an interesting question what we should say about cases which are possible, where in the end I just do it because you're mum and you know, and it really isn't much more than, I mean, of course, if you're my mum, then I love you and there's all sorts of other things going on. But supposing you imagine someone who really does end up, shall we say persuasion? Maybe it can't even count as persuasion. What I was trying to think is that I never really come to share any more specific reasons, but the fact of my respect for you makes me defer. Then I think that isn't persuasion. That's perhaps just a kind of a more empty moral testimony. And there are interesting issues about what's missing in cases of moral testimony, whether I can learn and act on a piece of moral judgment on your say-so is a question that Alison Hills and Paulina Sliwa and others are writing interestingly about now, because it is sort of strangely empty. If I don't gain understanding of why I should, or at least understanding of the reasons why you think I should do this thing, and that I become persuaded by those so that I really grasp the issue, I'm not sure it would even really count as persuasion. Yeah, thank you.
Miranda, thank you so much. There are a few questions left. I apologize we didn't get, including some from me. It's the problem with running around with the microphone is you don't get to do anything with it. Miranda, that was an extremely interesting talk and discussion. Thank you very much. I have a couple of announcements. Maybe if I can just, I see all these, Anna has got these bags for us, so it's a little mini Christmas birthday festivity here. Some of you have already been quick in the draw and got them, I saw. But please help yourself. We've got lunch prepared for outside, as I think most of you know. We're going, after tonight, we go straight to dinner after at 6 o'clock straight away, just so that that's clear to everybody. And there will be people to usher and herd us along. I hope nobody will get lost or anything like that. And just a final reminder, again, what I think you all know from the information, that we're not meeting here tomorrow. We're meeting over in Biskopshuset, which is a quite beautiful building as well. This is a modern building, very nice, but Biskopshuset is a very beautiful building. So I just want to remind you of that as well. So Thanks again, Miranda, for a wonderful talk.